Hi there, my name's Gordon McCrory. I am the Happiness Guy, and this is a video on the biggest challenge that I think most of us face and how to overcome it. And when I say the biggest challenge most of us face, I think mostly we're unaware that this is the biggest challenge, but I'm interested in your thoughts on this as well. So I think that when we're looking at the challenges we face, there's two categories. There's the actual thing itself, and then the stories we tell ourselves about the thing. And then we retell, and that generates emotions. So what's your thought? How much of our pain that we experience, and I mean mental and emotional pain, how much of that pain is based on just the thing itself, and how much of it's based on the stories we tell ourselves? So for me, I'm thinking that it's about, and probably more than this, it's maybe 80% more the stories that we tell ourselves, and only maybe about 20% of what's actually going on in life. So with that in mind, if we could change the stories, then we could lose in advance of, or more than 80% of the pain and anguish and anxiety that we feel in life. So I think that's really useful, and I'm going to come on to how to do that. But just before I do, let's look at going back to those the stories we tell ourselves. Well, we've got there's a few different aspects to it. There's the stories we tell ourselves, and if we tell ourselves these stories for long enough, they become a belief. So it's immovable. We become absolutely certain of it because we've heard it so often, and we repeat the same stories. And then ultimately then it becomes part of our identity. We can really become quite limited as a result of just hearing the same story again and again and again. No offense to North Korea, but it's that sort of thing where if we just keep telling ourselves the same story, nothing else becomes, it's not even possible, because we've heard the one thing so often we think that must be the truth. So when you're looking at your stories, have a think about these things. How do you describe things to yourself? Do you tend to describe things like with a positive slant, or have you got a negativity bias? My experience is that most people have a negativity bias. That's fairly typical, and it's species wide as well. It's possible to change it. I'll come on to that, but yeah, we've got a negativity bias. Within our vocabulary, we know more negative words, so we're actually more skilled at describing things negatively than positively. We can say things like, it was a catastrophe, or it was a car crash, or a train wreck, or whatever, or it's a nightmare. But when things are going okay or quite well, we go, well, how are things? It's like, fine, they're okay. We don't have the same strong vocabulary on the positive as the negative, and that makes it actually very difficult to tell ourselves strong positive stories. I remember when I owned the gym, people used to laugh at me, well, probably often, not purposefully, because I would say awesome a lot, because I just was, I guess, quite excitable. So I use lots of positive language, awesome and fabulous. Think about the weather. How do you describe the weather? It's miserable. Is the weather miserable? Really? I mean, I know it's Glasgow for anyone watching outside Glasgow. Maybe your weather's not miserable, but in Glasgow we often think the weather's miserable, but it's not. It's just raining. It's grey. So how do we describe things? The reason it's important is because how we describe things changes how we feel about how we feel, and then how we feel changes the thoughts that we're going to have. So if we think a thought that's negative, we'll feel a feeling that's negative, and we'll think another thought that's negative. And what that all leads us to is becoming negative, and we become problem focused. We struggle to look on the bright side, because we're that used to just having this negative way of describing things. And over time, the more and more negative stories we tell ourselves, the more and more negative we become. So our identity actually shifts as a result of the stories that we tell ourselves. And I would say that there's maybe some things that are around that. We're obviously doing that unconsciously. So now I'm bringing it to people's attention. They become a habit. So again, that is a way of saying they're unconscious. They're not a good habit, they're a bad habit. And to replace a habit, you need to do something different. You can't just stop telling yourself any stories. You need to tell yourself better stories. Are your stories limiting you? They normally are. And what about, are they harmful? harmful. Maybe limiting is harmful enough, but maybe it's worse than that. Maybe the stories you tell yourself create anxiety or kind of keep you trapped or make things seem hopeless. So I think that we need to reprogram the stories that we tell ourselves. So how do we do that? How do we actually go about kind of reprogramming our stories? And what would, maybe even before we get to that, how's this for a question? What would your life be like without all that negative self-talk? Going back to that 80-20 thing, if you weren't doing that anymore, then what would life be like? And it might be so much better, and I bet it would be. So that's the beginning to this. We've got all these negative stories that we're telling ourselves that's creating the majority of the pain that we're experiencing. How do we move beyond that? Well, I'll cover that in my second video on this topic, which is coming right up.